live. All right, 1031 exchanges. So I have to tell you guys this, and welcome to the show, Billie Cook.
Thank you.
Back.
Thank you.
Mr. Ploetz, great to see you. So I had to give a speech at a 1031 exchange event, and this is when I was working at the Union Tribune, and so I went there and I had a couple of jokes that I wrote. And
1031 jokes?
Yeah, 1031 jokes. That was not easy.
Are you going to tell us them right now?
I'm going to try to give you the scope of what one of them was.
Okay.
And essentially it was...
Just really nerdy tax code jokes.
No. A 1031 exchange. So McDonald's, it used to be that they'd only serve breakfast up until 10:30.
Okay.
So the 1031 exchange was somebody coming in, buying cheeseburgers, and running around and trying to trade with people who already had.
This actually isn't a terrible joke. It's not bad.
It was good. It was really good. I didn't set it up that way. I don't quite have the right setting to actually set it up the way I set it up. But that's what a 1031
but you need to be
is.
smoking a cigar and holding a whiskey while you're telling it.
So I have plenty of time to set it up. But that was the crux of the joke. That's a 1031 exchange. It happens at McDonald's. People wanted breakfast food.
A lot of
but
people,
they were too late.
A lot of people probably would have assumed that's what it was too. They had no clue that it actually has to do with real estate.
Well, let's talk about what it really is.
Yeah.
Well, like your McDonald's situation, there's some financial benefit to it. So 1031, of course, refers to the IRS tax code, 1031. And the idea of it is that you can sell an investment property. So, of course, let's back up a step, which is...
Has to be an investment property.
Has to be an investment property. If I sell my primary residence, a house that I'm living in, and I have gains of less than $250,000 as a single man or less than $500,000 as a married man, those gains are tax-free. Typically, if I sell an investment property, I need to pay capital gains on anything that I make. A 1031 exchange allows homeowners or investors in order to defer that tax. So let's just say I own a property and I am going to 1031 exchange it. It means that, and I've got $100,000 worth of equity, I sell the property, but rather than ever touching that $100,000, I need to roll it, put it into another investment, which the IRS considers like kind. And there's a couple of rules to it. It needs to be of equal or greater value, and you need to be able to replace the debt, is the way that they set it up. So here's the basic thought process behind the 1031 exchange. A couple of different things. Number one is, what is like kind? Like kind means I can sell a condo in Oceanside and purchase single family. So I can buy a single family detached condo, townhome, anything like that in anywhere in the United States. But like kind also means that I can purchase a multifamily, which would be like an apartment complex. I can purchase a DST. I can purchase a TIC. A TIC is a tenant in common. There's a variety of different things that the IRS tax code deems as quote unquote like kind.
What's a DST?
And a DST we are going to get into here with Billy, but a DST is a Delaware Statutory Trust. How about that? I got that. I've been practicing that for a whole week just to be able to say it quickly.
That's why we're just going to say DST the rest of the time.
Yeah, just because Steve is going to struggle saying Delaware Statutory Trust, which is just the name for an investment class. But this 1031 comes with some rules. And so some basic rules to it. Number one, you can do it a couple of different directions, and we'll talk about reverse exchanges in a moment. But a 1031 exchange is I sell an investment property, and it has closed escrow. And now I'm going to roll that money into one of these like-kind properties, or types of investment classes is what I should say. They being the IRS, put some limitations on it. Number one is I'm not allowed to touch any of that money. So I make $100,000, it needs to go to a qualified intermediate, what they call a QI.
Okay.
So that money doesn't come to me. It doesn't sit in my bank account and then I decide, hey, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to buy another investment. So that's rule number one. Rule number two is that it needs to be of equal or greater value. So I make $100,000 and or replace the debt. But there's also some other ways that you can identify the property, and they give you time limits. So close escrow, I've got 45 days to identify 3 properties, is one of several different ways, and Billy can correct me if I'm slightly off here on some of the other
Please
ways.
do, Billy.
Good so far.
Good. So you've got 45 days to identify up to 3 properties that we're going to roll our money into. So far this sounds super complex, but and then after those 45 days of identifying it, then I have 180 days to close the deal out. Here's the basics of it. Here it is in Steve Ploetz layman terms, just so I can understand it. I've got an investment property. Through the IRS, I'm allowed to depreciate that. 27.5 years, I'm allowed to depreciate. However, when I sell it, I'm required to recapture that depreciation no matter what. So I've depreciated the hell out of this property. And now what I want to do is I want to roll it over into something else so I can restart my depreciation, and maybe I can trade up my investment. If I'm making 5% on my rental in Oceanside, maybe there's an opportunity that I can go somewhere else. You and I have talked at length about the challenges of buying and selling in the same market at the same time. And I would say there are advantages and disadvantages to 1031s as there are to DSTs and TICs and all these different things that we should flesh out. But I think that a lot of people will do a 1031 where they will sell in the San Diego market and then immediately turn around and buy in the San Diego market. And many times those as investments don't really make total sense. Yes, you're able to restart the clock on the depreciation, but buying and selling in the same market, if you've got all that equity, now all of a sudden you're sidestepping into the same kind of thing, or perhaps are you overpaying for a property, et cetera, et cetera. So advantages and disadvantages, and so probably what we will want to do is eventually get into the idea of what is a DST and what is a TIC. And so why don't Billy, if it's all right,
Jump into that.
I'm going to lead this. Why don't you sit here and I'll sit in the middle.
I got to be honest with you. I totally spaced out. Can you say all that again?
Just one more time.
Can you start all over?
1031 is an IRS code.
Please add to that, Billy.
Okay. So two of the things Steve mentioned, TICs and DSTs. Both of them were created to help your individual investor be able to get access to some, we call them bigger, better properties. Not necessarily better, but have access to greater diversification. So they're multiple owner properties, meaning a TIC will let you have up to 35 investors inside of it. So if we want to identify a commercial property that we want to 1035 exchange into, or 1031 exchange, sorry, now I'm mixing tax codes, then we can get up to 35 investors. We identify the property, we can 1031 into it. The downside to the TIC is each individual investor has to qualify for the loan. They all have an ownership of the actual property. And there's some other challenges as far as keeping the 1031 intact and making sure that they don't get taxed on the money.
Let me make this a little bit simpler. So if I have an investment property, say it was however I got it, and property values are up a lot.
Yes.
I also own my primary residence.
Right.
So I'm like, you know what? I kind of want to cash in. But if I really want to cash in, I may have to sell my primary residence. Then I can take the cash tax-free up to $250 or $500, whatever. Right. But then maybe I could roll over, use a 1031 exchange. It's kind of like a rollover. You're taking it from this property, you're rolling it over into this property, and you're taking everything with you, right? You're taking your tax basis and all that stuff. I mean, you still have to recapture depreciation eventually, right?
Yes, correct.
There's no way to avoid it, but by avoiding it per transaction, you could essentially grow up your real estate holdings.
Exactly.
Because you're using gross money the whole time.
Yep.
That's essentially the gist.
And you had mentioned selling your primary residence, of course, as a different route. That was one route.
Yeah, it's like, hey, if I own a primary and I have an investment, if I want to cash out of what I think is a high market, I need to do that with my primary.
Absolutely.
Yep. Because now I can get the tax-free money today, cool. But the tax advantage in 1031s and in investment real estate is more about rolling it over.
Absolutely.
So maybe you take it from something that's more aggressive to something that's more conservative.
And of course, you can take it from one. You can take it from a condo in Oceanside and then diversify into and 1031 into multiple properties in multiple different markets. Yeah. We could go into Arizona. We could go into Branson, Missouri. We can go into a variety of different places where there might be more opportunity. Some people feel like, wow, what's happening in the San Diego market is that it appears that prices are very high. The question becomes, is it inflated?
Yep.
And you could look for more emerging markets.
Detroit?
Detroit, I mean, by all means, and I know, and I think that there are some places that I saw a study recently talking about San Diego and talking about California in general about the mass exodus of people that feel like, hey, I'm a millennial, hey, I'm trying to get started in building a family, and it's extremely difficult for me to get started and get ahead in California because of the cost of housing, the cost of living, et cetera. So they're going to places that are growing and where it's much more affordable. Wouldn't it be interesting to take 1031 allows you to take some of the value, the equity that you have within San Diego and put it and roll it into a variety of different emerging markets. That's the benefit. Now, here's my take on a DST and some of the benefits of a DST or any of these other situations.
What's a DST again?
So when you go through this process of selling your investment property, you have 45 days to identify a property. And then if you don't identify something or whatever you identify within those 45 days, if you don't buy it, then you're screwed. That's the way that it works. So let's just say hypothetically.
But by screwed, you mean you just have to pay the taxes you owe anyway?
No, actually, you're screwed. Yes, you have to pay the taxes. But that's the whole reason, that's the whole point of a 1031 exchange, is that what you're trying to do, because think about if you owned a property for 25 years, not only do you need to pay taxes on the gains, you also are required to recapture all of that depreciation that you've been doing over the years. The whole purpose of the 1031 is so that you can defer that and essentially, to me, it's like good procrastinating is the 1031. I'll deal with the tax later. I'll just defer it, defer it, defer it. Meanwhile, as Billy says, you're allowed to leverage your way into larger investments. You can go, I've had numerous clients that purchased a primary residence, then moved and purchased another primary residence, then turned their old primary residence into an investment and 1031 that into apartment complexes. Because then you can get into some property where there's some real leverage. So here's my example of why I think that every investor should at least identify a DST. I'm selling an investment property, and you are going to let me buy your place because we're boys. And you say, hey, you know what? I've got this investment property. It's not going to even be on the market. It's going to be super easy. Don't worry. Just 1031 into my property. So within my 45 days, I identify your place. It's not in this market. I don't need to worry about competing and multiple offers and owner-occupied buyers and all this different stuff. I'm buying Derek's place. It's easy. Then I identify it within those 45 days. Then after that, I've got 180 days to purchase it. Well, within those 180 days, I discover something. And a couple things to note from the purchasing side. Number one is, as an investor, the lender requires more information about the property. They require if it's properties in an HOA community, they need an HOA cert. They need to know that the HOA is in good standing. Typically, an investment property requires a larger down payment. Typically, it requires 25%. There are cases where you can do it with 20%. But let's just say hypothetically we go through that situation and then I discovered that there's something wrong with the property. Maybe it has to do with issues with the property itself. Maybe you decide you're not going to sell it anymore. My 45 days has expired and now I'm in a situation where I have to pay the tax. I was going to say I was screwed, but I know that you and Uncle Sam don't like us saying that. So I was just going to say, now I'm required to pay the tax. The benefit of identifying a DST, which Billy will get into, is it gives me a very simple fallback. It costs nothing to identify a property, or excuse me, it costs nothing to identify a DST in the same way that it costs nothing to identify any other property. So you might as well always have it as a backup, because otherwise what ends up happening is your hand is forced. And if we're in that situation and I discover that it needs a new roof and it's going to cost $25,000 and you say, Steve, we're boys, but I'm not going to pay for a new roof. My only option as a way to defer the tax, to execute the 1031, is to take it on no matter what.
I would just say, Steve, it'd be cheaper for you to get a new roof than to pay the taxes.
Luckily, my wallet is very thick.
You know that big wallet that you have?
Now is the time when that big wallet comes in
We've been
handy.
talking about it for years. And
I think to Steve's point, though, in some of those scenarios, a lot of times when the 1031, we've seen, and we have a recent example where they identified one property. It was a condo. There were some issues with the complex. Lender didn't want to lend. That was the only property they identified. Now it's the 50th day, right? So they're out of the identification period. They have to buy that property, or they're going to have to pay tax and recapture the depreciation, where if you gave them that alternative, they probably wouldn't have sold their original investment. They probably just kept collecting the rents and cash flowing it, not paying the taxes, and been happy with it. But for whatever reason, that scenario, they decided they wanted to sell that, kind of capture those gains and move on to something different. And so I think that's kind of where a lot of times we see these deals kind of go sideways, is if they only identify one, or they identify 3 properties and it's in a very competitive market, and you get stuck competing with 7 or 8 buyers, and now you have to close on one of those, and you end up overpaying, and then it doesn't make as much sense as your original investment that you just sold it.
And we've talked about numerous times that anytime you are forced to do something in this market, that's a bad investment.
you just don't want to ever put yourself in a situation
You don't
where
want
you
to
have to do something.
Where you have to do something, where you have to accept their offer. We talked about it with the contingency of selling a property and buying another one, et cetera. There's a variety of different things where this is a scenario where you're potentially, if you set it up incorrectly, your hand can be forced. Now that said, there are advantages and disadvantages to all of these investment classes. And so let's talk about some of them. Number one, just simply 1031ing into a single family home. If I 1031 into a single family home, I go like kind and I have a condo in Oceanside and I want to buy a house in North Park or a house in Arizona. Certainly it would depend on if it's local or not. But I need to actually deal with tenants, and of course in California deal with those kinds of laws that if I have a bad tenant or a bad experience or they destroy the property or I need to evict them, if I've hired a property manager dealing with all of those fees, unless I'm taking it on myself, they are more involved, let's say. Having a rental, and whether it's local or anywhere in the United States, there's a certain amount of energy and effort that goes required with it. With a DST, in my opinion, there is less pride that goes into it. Oftentimes, as Billy and I have talked about, there is a pride that people take when they drive to work and drive by their investment property and are able to say, yep, there it is.
A lot of times they'll overpay for that ability to
absolutely
be able to go drive by it, see the tenants walking out to pick up the newspaper, and
believe me, you don't want to see anything. You're like, yeah.
But I will tell you, one of the very first investment properties that I purchased, every time my wife and I purchased, every time that we were in that area, I would drive by their house. And Leah used to tell me all the time, this is the stupidest thing ever. Number one, the house is still going to be there. If it was on fire, you would know about it. Number two, they might be looking out their window and they see their landlord going by at 1.5 miles an hour, creepily looking through his window. But there's a pride factor to it, for sure. With a DST, it's more of the idea of set it and forget it. And so we're talking advantages and disadvantages. Some advantages would be you don't have to deal with the headache of a property manager because you're not as involved. It's more hands-off. If you're older, my opinion, makes more sense to go with the DST because it's more of mailbox money.
Are these the kind of, are DSTs, are these the sort of like the publicly traded type things? Like real estate investment trusts?
They are similar but fundamentally different in a lot of ways. And that would be, I think that would be a whole nother segment as far as the difference between publicly traded REITs and a DST. One of the fundamental differences is you have a beneficial ownership in the trust that's set up. And there's one underlying building, 3 underlying buildings, whatever it is, inside of that DST. So when that DST gets liquidated, it's more like a regular real estate transaction. You can start the 1031 clock all over again. You have 45 days to identify a new property, 180 to close on a property, that sort of a thing. Whereas the publicly traded REITs are a little more ambiguous, where you're not really seeing those transactions go on a day-to-day basis. You're just kind of collecting the yield on a monthly basis.
Gotcha.
So
okay.
similar in that effect, where you're collecting the yield on a monthly basis, but
and all the DSTs are different.
They are. So you can have multifamily DSTs. You could have you could have industrial, you could have a healthcare. You know, we see people 1031 into land. I mean, you can have whatever you want
I'm
inside of
assuming
it.
you don't have to 1031 into DSTs. You could just buy into them.
You could do cash investment into them as well. Yep.
Yeah, I had a feeling. So I had this intuition thing
Yeah,
going
very-
for me.
Boy,
Keeps
very
working out.
insightful.
yes, you are on it, Mr. Credit.
Keep-
But
Keeps
if you
working out.
if you do a cash investment into it, it's just like real estate. So at the you lose all control when you go into the DST. The parent company has complete control. When it goes full cycle, meaning they sell the building, whatever the appreciation is, now you know the clock resets. So if you put in $100 grand, it's now worth $150,000. You know, you're going to 1031 $150,000. If there was some leverage on that property, meaning they use 50% loan to value, then you're going to have to 1031 into a $250,000 building with at least $100,000 of debt and an additional $150 of equity on top of it.
Or you can pay the tax.
Or you could pay the tax and just walk away.
Yeah.
Yep. Which is
Terrible. The end of the world.
you get screwed when you do
You'll
that.
be screwed.
You'll be screwed.
Listen, if you're making money, you're paying taxes.
I agree with that.
Yep.
My
But if you don't have to pay tax, because the challenge for me with 1031 is that I'm the type of guy who likes to take money off the table.
right.
But you cannot do that in 1031.
Nope.
So whether it's the casino or whatever,
Let it ride.
see, that's not my thing. I like to be able to go, okay, we made 250,000. I'll take 150 of that to the bank. Let's play with the other 100. Can't do that in this situation.
Absolutely.
You got to roll the whole 250 into this new deal.
Absolutely. And I would say, of course, the alternative, the other side of the coin, in my opinion, is you were originally. We're looking at it in the Vegas eyes. So you had it in Vegas and you made $100,000 and you were getting some kind of return on that. And now you're able to get a similar return, but instead on a larger dollar. Mm-hmm. So instead of investing 100, I'm able to roll my 100 into 500 or whatever it may be and be able to get a similar return of 5%. The numbers can get larger. I agree that for your style of investing, which is take the profit, take it off the table, there are downsides to 1031. I would also say there's downsides to paying the tax. For my style, which is, I don't know if I would say my style is let it ride, but my style is...
Don't pay the tax.
Yeah, don't.
My style is stay in the market, I would say.
Okay.
Stay invested, yeah.
Stay invested. And obviously a lot of it has to do with where you are in your life personally and and those kinds of situations. But what I like about a DST is that even for someone that is older that doesn't want the headache of being a property manager or dealing with actual tenants, that then, I mean, obviously there's tenants within the giant scope of a DST, but there's a professional company that is handling it and that is going to be paying the dividends.
Yes, you're essentially, for theoretically, no cost in the situation. You're having someone, you don't have no out-of-pocket cost. You're having someone professional run the situation.
Right.
Who knows, who
Yeah,
in theory
there's definitely
knows more
costs,
than you do.
right? Obviously.
Yeah,
But
there's a cost, but it's not like you're writing a check to them every
no,
month.
yeah.
Right.
I think to Steve's point as well, it allows you to maybe take some money off the table in a market that maybe is appreciated more than a lot of people ever would have thought, right? A lot of people that own real estate here in San Diego, especially in some of the coastal communities that bought a home 20 years ago, the value of their home might be worth more than they ever thought it might be.
They're
Right?
gone up 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's a lot
people have doubled their money.
Yeah, a lot of condos people bought for 250, they were 500.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
So a
all
lot
over
of
the
those
place.
scenarios where maybe they still want to stay invested in real estate, but maybe want to identify an opportunity that has a little more upside than what they're currently in because they don't believe it can go up another 100% in that same period of
You can
time.
buy a 3-bedroom home in Ferguson, Missouri for 20 grand,
Wow.
Well, and so here's,
and you can rent it for 800.
Wow.
I guess what I would say is
That's incredible.
we've got the conversation on whether doing a 1031 or not doing a 1031 is a good idea. And whether the idea is take it off the table and pay the taxes, we could say Derek Evans is fighting for, or whether, I don't like to say let it ride, but stay invested in the market and do a 1031. Here's my opinion, here's the takeaway. If you're going to do a 1031, have a fallback. And a DST becomes a great fallback. Even if you've identified the exact property that you want, it costs you nothing, put it in there. Because that way, if there's the 0.5% chance that something goes really sour, then at least, and you're pot committed to the 1031, now you can at least know that it can roll on.
Yeah, true. Yeah, no reason not to.
Right.
There's no downside, right?
There's zero downside.
So
I mean,
love
so you
that.
identify it and you never use it. Okay, fine.
No downside. I'm all about no downside.
Right.
Now you're talking my language.
Now you're
And I'm not saying I would just pay the tax either, but that's the one thing that to me is a bummer about the 1031. But at the same time, it's really the only way you can make a profit and not have to pay the IRS.
Yeah, I was going to say if you were to do that in any stock, right? Let's say I own Amazon right now and I want to sell Amazon. I can't 1031 Amazon into whatever I think is going to be the next Amazon.
And
right?
you have to capture and you
I have to pay the tax and move on.
Yeah, that really sucks. It really does. It really sucks.
Yeah. Yeah, because what it requires is that you be excellent in your investment choices time and again. And here's what I would say. With 1031, I have a great investment, let's just say hypothetically, of an investment in Oceanside. And then I had identified 2 other properties and they didn't work, but I had a backup as a DST. So then I 1031 into a DST and the DST performs average, let's just say. I've got the ability to then keep going. I can 1031 out of the DST and into another property that I've identified. And yes, there are fees associated with the 1031, but it allows me to keep the chain going. To Billy's example, I buy Amazon and it's a great stock, and then I buy something else and it's a dog. I have to sit with that, and then I get to start all over, and I guess it offsets my taxes or whatever it is. But each one is independent.
Yeah.
This way, you're more linked, and people like to be linked.
Yeah.
I kind of feel like we should link.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's some linking that is really beneficial.
We're linked enough. Enough link.
When they made me move this chair even closer to fit within the frame, I felt linked.
Plenty of link. Okay, so obviously if you have 1031 questions, don't ask any of us, but no, don't ask me, ask these guys. I've never done 1031 exchange. I've been close in a couple of situations.
So you always sold and paid the taxes?
I have paid the taxes
okay.
because I didn't really have a big gain. You know, I didn't have a giant gain to go, all right, this is really going to change things, you know. But I wanted to exit, and it turns out I was right both times. So I'm happy about that.
And to that point, when that time comes, I think that it's important that everybody looks at all the data. In some cases, 1031 is not going to make sense, in my opinion. In some cases, it's going to make sense whether the profit is too small or you need the money right now or whatever it may be.
You have a $30,000 profit and you think the market's frothy.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. To jump back in the market may not make sense.
Yeah, it definitely didn't. But you could, you could always roll it into a DST.
You could always roll it in
Delaware statutory trust.
Yep.
Or you could look at emerging markets and you could figure out a way. I mean, I have numerous clients that have always said the problem with selling their California real estate is they're concerned. I mean, typically it's their primary home. They're never going to be able to come back because they're going to, if they go to wherever they go, anywhere other than California or New York, there's a couple of places obviously, and it's not getting cheap around the country, but a lot of people feel like if I get out of California, I can never come back. By keeping an investment property or doing a 1031, it allows you to crack into some of these markets and at least create a foothold.
Words from the wise Steve Ploetz, ladies and gentlemen. In case you haven't been paying attention, you should rewind and hear the whole thing. It was Steve talking the entire time about his opinions.
Yeah, this is great. This is my platform.
That's amazing. Anything else you think we should know about this, Billy?
No, I think
it's pretty good.
Yeah, I think Steve did a pretty good job covering it today.
Why did you have to say that? I mean, if you could have just been
that's
like,
the whole reason he's on.
You could have been like, yeah, you know, well, Steve didn't do a great job, but I don't really have time to pick up the slack, so here's my phone number. Let's be honest about this. We'll finish with this.
Wait, have we not been honest about all the other stuff?
Well, I don't know. I can't speak for you. I don't know. Sounded fine.
Yeah.
But in reality, let me start with that instead. In reality, the 1031 exchange is one of the most powerful IRS gifts that exists.
Agreed.
I agree with that.
For the fact that there's nothing else like it. There's nothing else that you can buy, have a profit on, and not pay the tax on. The stipulations are very committal, which makes sense for such a nice benefit. You should have to make a big commitment. If you could piecemeal, you know, the 1031, that would be like, hey, what's going on here? But the fact that it, you know, it is a committal thing, I do believe that's good. It has been on the chopping block too. Let's be honest.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, this last run, a lot of, I think one of the DST companies we work with, January was one of their biggest months ever because they were trying to get everything done, or a lot of investors were trying to get everything done before any of the tax law change happened, and so that kind of fell within their 45-day window.
And with all the tax law changes, of course, now we've got the mortgage amount that is more than $750,000. That stuff only applies to primary residence and to second homes. So as an investment property, you're exempt. The $10,000 cap on taxes, again, primary homes and second homes. So as an investment property, no limits.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things.
Those are real costs, and they can be really written off.
Absolutely.
And the depreciation is still there. So, and my only point I'm trying to make there is, hey, this is a huge tax advantage. Anytime they talk about tax reform, it's one of the things that comes up as, hey, one day,
Yeah.
we're not going to be able to do this anymore. It's too good.
Yeah.
So, if there were an opportunity to 1031 exchange, I know for sure right now, if I had a lot of investment real estate holdings, I would be taking a very hard look at that right now.
Yeah.
How to diversify into something that is a little more of a value stock. I would say this is kind of, you know, California's a growth stock from a real estate standpoint.
Especially Southern California.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, it's been done really, really well. It's done really, really well for the past 6 or 7 years. And I would be looking at those apartment complexes in Arizona.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's one of the beautiful things about a DST is, you know, you get up to 500 investors typically. So it allows your average individual who might own a $500,000 investment property to get access to a $50 or $100 million apartment complex that normally they would never have access to.
And they just get a fractional ownership,
Yeah,
basically.
exactly. And so that's going to perform very differently than your single family residential in Carlsbad or
Absolutely.
San Diego.
And they can get in with whatever amount. Like if they have 180 grand
Yep. Then they'll have just like a 0.002% fractional ownership. $100 million.
Yeah, and think about that, a vacancy, 1 month vacancy at a single family home, well, that means no rent this year, but if I've got 600 units in an apartment complex and one of those units is vacant,
You don't even notice it.
you don't even notice it. You talk about diversification and safety, et cetera. That's some of the benefits of the DST.
All right, that's all we know. That's it. We have nothing else. We have peaked.
That's it.
Share this video. Make your friends smarter than everyone else. See you next time.